The story begins in a quiet rural county where the land stretches as far as the eye can see. For generations, this particular stretch of soil, woods, and open pasture had belonged to one family, a family that had poured their sweat, blood, and pride into cultivating it. The man at the center of our story was not just any landowner. He was the proud descendant of a long line of farmers and business-minded people who had weathered decades of challenges to hold on to what was theirs. This man was no stranger to responsibility. From a young age, he had been taught the importance of the land. His father had walked him through every acre, pointing out where his grandfather had built the first fences, where the family had dug wells by hand, and where they had planted their first crops. Every corner of that property carried a story. The barn that still stood from the 1930s, the massive oak tree where family reunions were held, the gentle slope that overlooked a small river. When his father passed away, the land became his. It wasn't just an inheritance in legal terms. It was the passing of a legacy. He understood that this property was more than dirt and grass. It was history, identity, and opportunity. The sheer size of it, 1,500 acres, was staggering to most people in the community. It wasn't just valuable in monetary terms. It was prime land in a county where development was slowly creeping in from the nearby city. Real estate developers had been eyeing properties like his for years, knowing they could fetch a fortune by turning farmland into residential subdivisions or commercial spaces. Despite offers from realtors and investors, he had no intention of selling. To him, selling the land would have been the equivalent of erasing his family's story from the county's history books. This wasn't land to flip for a quick profit. It was the foundation of everything his family had worked for. It provided space for farming, for leasing to other farmers, for small-scale timber harvesting, and for recreational uses like fishing and hunting. It was a self-sustaining asset that could continue to generate income for decades without losing its core value. But with great assets often come great challenges. In certain parts of the country, particularly rural communities, powerful homeowner associations, developers, and even local government bodies can use legal loopholes to acquire land they want. And as much as he loved his land, he also knew it made him a target. The sheer fact that a black man in the South owned that much prime property made him stand out in a way that some didn't appreciate. There were unspoken resentments, old prejudices that never fully disappeared, and whispers about how that land should be put to better use, meaning use that didn't involve him or his family. He was aware of the threats, but he felt confident that his title, deeds, survey maps, and years of paid taxes would keep him safe. What he didn't know was that the people who wanted his land were already laying the groundwork for something far more underhanded. They weren't going to come to him directly with a purchase offer anymore. They were planning to take it without his permission, using legal tricks and paperwork manipulation to make it seem like they had the right all along. And because they underestimated him, they never imagined he'd be able to fight back in a way they'd never forget. This wasn't just a piece of property. It was a living archive of his family's endurance. The land had been in the family for so long that stories about it had been passed down through oral history as much as through legal documents. His great-great-grandfather had acquired it during a time when it was almost impossible for Black Americans to own land, especially in large tracts. It was bought acre by acre, often paid for in cash earned through hard, back-breaking labor. Some of the land was won in trades, some purchased from neighbors, and some secured through opportunities few people of color could access at the time. Over the years, the land had been a safe haven. It was where family members could live if times got hard, where they could farm for food when money was scarce, and where they could build a sense of independence in a world that often denied them dignity. It wasn't simply a financial investment. It was a fortress against the instability of the outside world. Every generation had added something to it. One built barns and livestock pens, another planted fruit orchards, another carved out a pond for fishing. The stories were endless about the winter storms they had survived, the summers when crops grew tall enough to hide a man walking through them, and the times they had gathered together for weddings, funerals, and harvest celebrations. It was also a symbol of defiance. In a region where history had been marked by systemic discrimination, the fact that his family had held on to 1,500 acres through wars, economic depressions, and racial hostility was a miracle in itself. They had endured attempts by opportunistic buyers to trick older relatives into signing away sections of land. They had fought legal battles when county officials tried to claim part of it for public use without fair compensation. Every time they had managed to hold on. That's why this land was sacred. It represented the unbroken line of his family's will to survive and thrive despite every obstacle thrown their way. Losing it wouldn't just mean losing a piece of real estate. It would mean breaking a chain that had taken more than a century to forge. It would mean erasing the tangible proof that his family had carved out a place in the world and defended it with everything they had. Even the soil felt personal. He knew the places where it turned dark and rich after rain, perfect for planting. He knew the rocky patches where old wagon wheels had once broken. He could walk the land blindfolded and still find his way, just by the feel of the terrain under his boots. To outsiders, it was just acreage with a market price. To him, it was memory, struggle, and triumph stitched into the earth itself. It was this deep connection that made the betrayal that was coming so much more devastating. When the HOA moved against him, they weren't just taking land. They were reaching back through history to try and take something his ancestors had already fought tooth and nail to protect. The first hints of trouble didn't come as a dramatic knock on the door or a threatening letter. They came quietly, disguised as paperwork and whispers in county offices. The HOA in question wasn't some small neighborhood watch with bake sales and block parties. It was a powerful, well-connected association that oversaw an upscale development on the edge of his property. Over the years, that development had crept closer and closer to his boundaries, with houses springing up where open fields used to be. He had seen it happen in other areas. A developer builds near someone's land, then HOA forms to maintain community standards, and slowly their influence grows beyond the development itself. Sometimes they even start claiming they have rights to land they've never legally owned. It's a subtle game, one that relies on people not paying attention to the small print. In this case, the HOA began filing quiet claims in county property records, stating that certain common areas and easements extended into his acreage. On paper, these looked like small strips of land, just a few feet here, a few yards there. But those small claims were strategically placed, and if you plotted them on a map, they cut into his property like teeth. At first, he thought it might be a clerical error. Maybe a surveyor had drawn a line wrong or the HOA map was outdated. But when he contacted the association to clear things up, the tone he got was anything but apologetic. They insisted their maps were correct. They spoke as if his family's boundary lines were a subject to review and hinted that long-term community use could mean they had rights under certain property laws. That's when he realized this wasn't an accident. It was a move. A calculated, coordinated step to establish a paper trail suggesting the HOA had legitimate claims to land they had no right to. The more of these claims they could stack up, the easier it would be to make a legal case down the line. If they could get a judge to agree that even a small portion belonged to them, they could chip away until they had something substantial. The worst part was, they had influence. HOA board members included lawyers, real estate agents, and even a former county planning commissioner. They knew the system and how to use it. And once they made their claims official in the county registry, it gave them the appearance of legitimacy, enough to scare off anyone thinking of helping him fight it. He knew then that this was no misunderstanding. This was a strategic land grab. They weren't coming at him with bulldozers or threats. They were coming with fine print, signatures, and stamps. the kind of weapons that could strip a man of his property without ever stepping foot on it. The boldness of what happened next was almost surreal. It started with a piece of mail that didn't make sense, a property tax notice for a parcel he didn't recognize. At first, he thought maybe it was a misprint, but when he looked closer, he realized the parcel number matched part of his land. The problem was, the notice wasn't addressed to him. It was addressed to someone else entirely. This led him down a rabbit hole of research. Pulling public records, he discovered that the HOA had sold not just one, but multiple portions of his property to private buyers. These weren't random strangers. Many were people already living in the HOA development. They had been told they were purchasing legitimate extensions of their lots, extra space for a bigger yard, or to build a pool. The HOA provided them with a verified document signed and notarized showing that the land was theirs to sell. In reality, those documents were a mix of manipulated surveys, altered plats, and outright fabrications. The HOA had taken their earlier false claims of ownership, filed them in county records, and then used them as the foundation to sell land they had no legal right to. It was the kind of fraud that relied on a mix of audacity and bureaucracy. If the paperwork looked official, most people wouldn't question it. Some of these sales were small, measured in yards. Others were massive, swallowing up entire fields he had used for grazing cattle. It was like waking up one morning to find that someone had gone into your bank account and transferred out chunks of money, not in one big heist, but in dozens of smaller withdrawals that no one noticed until the damage was already done. When he realized the scale of what had happened, the sense of violation was overwhelming. This wasn't a simple property dispute anymore. This was outright theft, carried out in the open under the guise of legality. The HOA wasn't just testing the boundaries. They had bulldozed past them and acted like it was their right. What made it worse was that the buyers, in most cases, had no idea they were part of something illegal. They thought they were making legitimate purchases. Some had already started building fences, patios, even small guest houses on the stolen land. And because those are sales that had been recorded by the county, reversing them would be a legal nightmare. Every fraudulent deed created a new layer of complexity, new owners, new mortgage companies, new property lines to untangle. It was a perfect trap, and the HOA knew it. By the time most victims realize land theft has occurred, so many other parties are involved that it's nearly impossible to get everything back without spending years in court. For the AE, this meant they could drag things out, making him spend more money on lawyers than the land was worth, at least in their eyes. But they had underestimated just how deeply he valued what they were trying to take. This wasn't just real estate. This was heritage. This was heritage. And if they thought he was going to let 1,500 acres disappear into the hands of fraudsters without a fight, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The more he dug into the paperwork, the more the stench of manipulation filled the air. It wasn't just that the HOA had been bold enough to sell land they didn't own. It was how carefully they had disguised the theft under layers of legal jargon, selective documentation, and half-truths dressed up as facts. They knew that in the eyes of most people, if a document was stamped, signed, and filed at the county clerk's office, it had to be legitimate. That's the power of appearance in real estate. They began their scheme by commissioning updated surveys from friendly surveyors who had long-standing ties to certain board members. These surveys conveniently redrew the property boundaries, extending HOA control plots into his acreage. The changes weren't always massive, sometimes just a few feet here, a narrow strip there. But over the course of multiple plats, these small shifts accumulated into a significant portion of his land. With those doctored surveys in hand, the HOA was able to draft quitclaim deeds, a type of property transfer document that essentially says, I transfer whatever rights I have to this property to you. The trick was, they didn't have any rights to transfer in the first place. But to the county recorder, a quitclaim deed doesn't require proof of ownership. It just requires the right format, the right signatures, and the right fee. Once those deeds were on file, they created the illusion of a chain of title, as if the HOA had owned the land all along and was simply selling it to a buyer. They also exploited a legal loophole involving prescriptive easements, which allow people to claim usage rights over land if they've been openly using it for a certain period of time without the owner stopping them. The HOA claimed that some of his land had been a community space for years, places where residents walked their dogs, rode bikes, or held events. In reality, these were fields and wooded areas he had deliberately left open because they were either grazing land or natural habitat. But in their story, that generosity became ammunition against him. The HOA lawyers even filed notices of a boundary dispute resolution in which they represented themselves as co-owners trying to resolve a technical disagreement with a neighbor. In those filings, they conveniently omitted that the neighbor, him, had never agreed to any such process. But once a dispute like that is logged in the system, it becomes part of the property's recorded history, giving future buyers the impression that there was some legitimacy to the HOA claims. This was fraud at a high level, the kind that hides behind the mask of bureaucracy. Every single step they took had a paper trail, and every paper looked official enough to scare off casual questioning. The real brilliance and danger of their scheme was that they didn't need to prove they were right. They only needed to create enough confusion to make it look like the situation was complicated. Complicated property situations are expensive to untangle, and they were betting he didn't have the resources to fight them. What they didn't understand was that he wasn't just collecting documents to prove they were wrong. He was building a map of every single falsehood, every manipulated survey, every forged signature. And with each discovery, his determination grew stronger. It was an envelope that first tipped him off, something plain and unremarkable in appearance, but carrying within it the first undeniable sign that something was seriously wrong. It was a property tax statement, but not for the full 1,500 acres. It was for a parcel of land he recognized, except the owner listed wasn't him. The county tax office wanted payment from someone else entirely, and that was the moment the alarm bells started ringing. The strangeness deepened when, just a few days later, another envelope arrived. This one was addressed to him, but the tax bill was noticeably smaller than what he usually paid. At first glance, it might have seemed like a blessing. A lower bill meant fewer taxes, right? But for a man who knew every inch of his property and every cent of his yearly expenses, it was a glaring red flag. The only reason taxes would go down was if the taxable acreage had shrunk. He didn't wait to speculate. The very next morning, he drove straight to the county assessor's office. Behind the counter, a clerk pulled up the parcel maps on her computer, and there it was. Portions of his land were now marked under different ownership. His name had been replaced by other names, people he had never met, addresses in the HOA subdivision, and in one case, the HOA itself. The clerk scrolled through the chain of title for each parcel, and that's when the flood of information hit him. Transactions had been recorded months earlier. Quiet, almost invisible transfers done without his knowledge. The HOA false claims had morphed into official deeds, and those deeds had been sold to buyers who thought they were making legitimate purchases. In the eyes of the county system, it was all legal because no one had flagged the fraud. It was a gut punch like no other. For generations, his family had guarded this land, paying taxes on time, keeping the boundaries clear, and holding on to every scrap of documentation to prove their right to it. Yet here it was, sliced apart and handed over to others without so much as a phone call or a certified letter to inform him. Oh, The betrayal was worse than the shock. He had trusted the county system, believing that the property he inherited was protected by the records that confirmed his ownership. Now he was looking at proof that the very same system could be manipulated by those with enough connections and enough nerve to exploit its blind spots. He left the assessor's office with copies of every suspicious document, his mind spinning with questions. How many parcels had been taken? How deep did this scheme go? Were there buyers who knew exactly what they were doing, or were they all victims too? And most importantly, how could he possibly unwind something that had been recorded as illegal in the eyes of the county without a fight that could last years? That night, he spread the documents across his kitchen table, arranging them by date and type. It was like staring at the pieces of a puzzle someone had been building behind his back. There were patterns, certain board members' names popping up repeatedly, certain surveyors and notaries involved in multiple sales, certain buyers clustered in specific areas of the development. This wasn't random, it was coordinated. The HOA might have thought he'd be blindsided and too overwhelmed to respond. But what they didn't realize was that they had just given him a roadmap of their entire operation. And he was going to follow it step by step until he figured out exactly how to turn their own game against them. The outrage came like a lightning strike, sudden, electric, and impossible to ignore. Sitting in his kitchen surrounded by a maze of deeds, plats, and tax records, he realized the only way to truly understand the scope of what they had done was to dig deeper than they ever expected. He started with the county's online database, cross-referencing every parcel that had once been under his name. When he found one with a different owner listed, he requested certified copies of every transfer document attached to it. The pattern began to take shape quickly. Transactions were often recorded in batches, sometimes on the same day, as if they'd lined up the sales in advance. The names of certain HOA board members popped up in suspicious roles, sometimes as a representative, sometimes as witnesses, sometimes even as the notary stamping the deal. Every new record he pulled was another piece of proof, and every piece made him more certain this wasn't sloppy bookkeeping or misunderstanding. This was deliberate, careful, and malicious, designed to pass under the radar until it was too late to fight when he finally had the stack of documents in chronological order. The story they told was damning. The HOA board had created a false narrative of ownership. Starting with altered survey lines and fabricated easement claims, those fraudulent foundations were then used to produce quitclaim deeds and warranty deeds that appeared legitimate on their face. The same few individuals' names surfaced over and over again, each time connected to a questionable transaction. Some acted as sellers, some as official witnesses, and others as the notaries whose stamps gave the illusion of authenticity. In several cases, the same notary had signed off on documents for both the seller and the buyer, a conflict of interest so blatant it would raise alarms to anyone looking closely. He also discovered a corrective deed CF filed quietly months later, altering property descriptions in ways that conveniently aligned with HOA interests. Every scrap of paper screamed coordination, not coincidence, and the deeper he went, the clearer it became that these were not isolated mistakes but steps in a long, calculated theft carried out by people who knew exactly how to weaponize the legal system against him. His first instinct was to storm into a lawyer's office and launch a lawsuit that would drag the HOA into the light. But he knew that moving too quickly could backfire. Court cases could drain resources, and the HOA lawyers would likely stall until he bled dry. Instead, he decided to play the long game. He began studying every angle of property law, foreclosure statutes, and lien rights, looking for a strategy that would not only recover what was his, but put him in a position of power over them. Late nights turned into early mornings as he pored over legal guides, court records, and state statutes. Law. He learned how titles could be clouded, how debts tied to property could force a sale, and how certain liens could override even fraudulent ownership transfers. He wasn't just learning to defend himself. He was arming himself with the tools to strike back in a way the AHO wouldn't see coming. It started with a hunch. As he pored over old survey maps late one night, cross-referencing them with the HOA development's current plat, something caught his eye. Several houses, large, expensive properties belonging to prominent HOA board members, seemed to sit dangerously close to the old family boundary. At first, he chalked it up to sloppy measurements, but the more he compared the layers of maps, the clearer the picture became. Decades earlier, when the subdivision was first laid out, someone had made what appeared to be a small adjustment to the development's property lines. That adjustment pushed the boundaries just far enough into his family's land to accommodate larger lots for a handful of choice homes. He decided to verify this suspicion the only way that truly mattered, by pulling the oldest official surveys on record, dating back to before the subdivision even existed. These original surveys had been done by reputable surveyors who were long gone, men who had no stake in modern politics or HOA squabbles. When he laid the original map over the current one, the misalignment jumped out like a scar across the landscape. In black and white, it was clear that several homes, driveways, and manicured lawns were sitting squarely on property that his family still legally owned. The realization hit him with a mix of shock and grim satisfaction. These weren't random houses. They belonged to the same individuals who had signed off on the fraudulent deeds, approved the altered plats, and pushed the narrative that parts of his land were theirs to use and sell. It wasn't just hypocrisy. It was an accidental confession. By building their own houses on stolen property, they had created a legal vulnerability so massive it could unravel their entire scheme. He began gathering every piece of evidence that confirmed the encroachment. Satellite images showing the gradual spread of lawns and fences over the property line. Tax records indicating those areas were never removed from his family's assessed acreage until the fraudulent transactions began. Utility easements that stopped exactly where his land started, only to mysteriously shift on later maps. Every scrap of proof tightened the noose. To make sure he wasn't missing anything, he hired an independent surveyor, someone from out of town with no ties to the community, to come and map the property using GPS technology. The results were even more damning than he expected. Not only were portions of these houses sitting on his land, but in some cases, entire structures were technically outside of their legal boundaries. Garages, patios, sheds, all built on property they had no lawful claim to. The surveyor's report was clear, precise, and indisputable, the kind of evidence that could stand unshaken in court. When he saw the final survey overlay, a slow, deliberate plan began to form in his mind. If the HOA thought they could use the legal system to strip him of his land, then he could use that same system to turn their comfortable lives upside down. These houses weren't just board members' pride and joy, they were their biggest investments, their symbols of status and security. And now they were built on a foundation that wasn't legally theirs at all. He knew from his months of studying property law that owning the ground beneath someone's home wasn't just a technicality. It was power. In most states, if a structure is built on someone else's land without a valid easement or agreement, the landowner has the legal right to demand its removal or to claim compensation. The amounts involved can be enormous, especially when the structure in question is a fully built home worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The leverage this gave him was unlike anything the HOA had anticipated. Instead of simply fighting to reclaim stolen parcels, he could now approach the situation from a position of undeniable strength. He began by quietly recording updated surveys and legal descriptions with the county, ensuring that his claim to the land beneath those houses was crystal clear in the public record. Once that was done, he consulted with a seasoned property attorney, not to launch a lawsuit right away, but to explore every possible way to use this discovery to his advantage. What the attorney confirmed only fueled his determination. Since the homes were built without proper legal right to the land, he could file claims that would cloud their titles. essentially freezing their ability to sell or refinance until the dispute was resolved. He could also pursue ejectment actions, which would legally force the homeowners to either remove the encroaching portions of their houses or pay him for the value of the land. And because these were board members who had directly participated in fraudulent activity against him, any negotiation would be entirely on his terms. He didn't move immediately. Instead, he started laying a quiet legal minefield. He filed preliminary notices of encroachment with the county, putting any future buyers or lenders on alert that the properties had unresolved land disputes. He made sure the notices referenced the exact survey data, dates, and documents proving his ownership, leaving no room for interpretation. At the same time, he began pulling financial records on each property, mortgages, equity lines, anything that could reveal how much debt the owners carried. If he forced them into a corner where selling became the only way out, he wanted to know exactly how much pressure they could handle before they cracked. He also considered the public perception. The HOA had been arrogant in their actions, but they relied heavily on their image of professionalism and community stewardship to maintain influence. If word spread that their own board members had built homes on stolen land, the credibility they'd worked so hard to maintain would shatter. That was another form of leverage, not just legal but social. Quietly, he let a few trusted allies in the community know what he'd discovered. These weren't gossip mongers, but people with influence, the kind whose words carried weight in local politics and business circles. Within weeks, whispers began circulating at community events and in private conversations. People were asking questions the HOA couldn't answer without incriminating themselves. The pressure wasn't explosive yet, but it was building, and he intended to control when and how it erupted. In the meantime, he continued documenting everything. Every board meeting where these individuals spoke on land use issues, every public statement they made about property rights, every email exchange or notice they sent to residents about maintaining property boundaries. He wanted a record that would show beyond any doubt that they understood the importance of legal property lines, yet had blatantly violated those principles when it suited them. With every new piece of evidence, his position grew stronger. He didn't just have the moral high ground. He had the legal and financial high ground as well. The HOA had tried to play him as the victim, but in reality, they had unknowingly handed him the keys to their own undoing. Once he had confirmed beyond all doubt that several HOA board members' homes were sitting on his land, he began the process of putting his legal rights into action. This wasn't a rash move. It was methodical and deliberate, each step taken with precision to ensure there would be no loopholes they could slip through later. His first move was to work with his attorney to file what are known as ownership claims, formal legal assertions recorded in the county's public records stating that he was the rightful owner of the land beneath the identified properties. These ownership claims were not just symbolic gestures. By placing them on record, he was making it impossible for those homeowners to transfer, refinance, or otherwise alter their property titles without addressing the dispute. Any potential buyer, lender, or title company pulling the property's history would immediately see that the land was contested. This would trigger an avalanche of complications for the board members involved. Once the ownership claims were securely filed, he moved to the next phase, liens. A lien is a legal hold placed on property to secure payment of a debt or obligation. In this case, the debt was the unpaid value of the land they had been occupying without his consent, in some cases for years. His attorney helped calculate fair market rental rates for the acreage beneath each encroaching home, factoring in the size of the land taken and the duration of its use. The figures were not small. For some of the larger encroachments, the total back rent due ran into the tens of thousands of dollars. By filing these liens, he created a direct financial obligation tied to each property. Even if the homeowners wanted to keep their houses exactly as they were, They would have to pay him to satisfy the lien before they could ever sell or refinance. And because liens accrue interest over time, the longer they tried to ignore them, the more expensive their problem would become. The reaction from the HOA board was almost immediate. The same individuals who had been smug and confident in their dealings with him were now frantically calling emergency meetings. Behind closed doors, they were debating how to respond. But he already knew they had no good options. If they fought him in court, the surveys and documentation would tear apart their defense. If they tried to negotiate, they would be doing so from a position of weakness. If they ignored him, the liens would keep growing and their ability to conduct normal business as homeowners and as HOA officials would grind to a halt. The beauty of this strategy was that it didn't require him to physically seize anything or evict anyone. The claims and liens worked quietly in the background, choking off their financial and legal flexibility until they had no choice but to deal with him. For the first time since this ordeal began, the balance of power had shifted entirely in his favor. With the ownership claims and liens firmly in place, he could have forced the issue immediately. But patience, he had learned, could be just as deadly as aggression in a legal fight. Property disputes are governed by a variety of deadlines, statutes of limitations, foreclosure waiting periods, notice requirements, and understanding them can make all the difference in the outcome. By carefully tracking these timelines, he realized that waiting could give him an even stronger legal footing. In some cases, state laws required a certain period of time to pass before a lien could be enforced through foreclosure. In others, property owners had a limited window in which they could challenge an ownership claim before it became much harder to dispute in court. The HOA board members didn't seem to fully grasp these timelines, and he had no intention of enlightening them. Every month that passed brought him closer to the point where his claims would be nearly unassailable. While he waited, he continued to quietly strengthen his case. He commissioned updated appraisals of the disputed land, ensuring he had current professional valuations to back up his demands. He monitored any changes to the properties, taking note of renovations or expansions that further encroached onto his land, actions that would only increase the amount they owed him. He kept meticulous records of every conversation, every letter, every meeting where the dispute was mentioned, knowing that these details could prove crucial if the matter ever went to trial. Patience also allowed the pressure on the board members to build naturally. As weeks turned into months, the liens began showing up on credit reports, making it harder for them to secure loans or refinance their mortgages. Real estate agents began quietly advising potential buyers to avoid their properties altogether. Neighbors started to hear rumors, and even those not directly involved in the dispute began questioning the leadership of the HOA. The once confident board members found themselves increasingly isolated, unable to rally the same level of support they had enjoyed before. And all the while, he kept his demeanor calm and collected. He didn't gloat, didn't antagonize them publicly, didn't give them any excuse to claim harassment or bad faith. He simply let the process run its course, knowing that time was now working in his favor. The HOA had made its move early, confident that he would either fold or be overwhelmed. But he had chosen a different path, one that allowed the slow, grinding force of the legal system to work for him rather than against him. By the time the key deadlines approached, his position was so strong that the board members could see the inevitable coming. The claims were locked in, the liens were enforceable, and the possibility of foreclosure loomed over their heads like a storm cloud they couldn't disperse. The same people who had once conspired to take his land were now faced with the very real prospect of losing their own homes. Not because he had acted impulsively, but because he had understood the value of waiting until the law itself tilted entirely in his direction. The moment the legal landscape tilted fully in his favor, he wasted no time turning leverage into action. The ownership claims had matured beyond dispute. The liens had ripened into enforceable debts. and every procedural safeguard that could have protected the board members had expired. He knew that hesitation now would only give them an opening to scramble for emergency relief, so he moved swiftly but with precision. With his attorney by his side, he initiated foreclosure proceedings on the properties sitting atop his land. These weren't threats, they were official filings, the kind that set an unavoidable clock ticking toward a public sale. Foreclosure in this context meant that the land, and by extension, the structures on it, could be sold to satisfy the debt the homeowners owed him. Because the debt stemmed from unpaid liens tied directly to his property, the law gave him the right to recoup his losses in the most direct way possible, by taking those homes to market. The filing sent shockwaves through the HOA community. Notices went up in the county courthouse announcing dates and times when the properties would be auctioned to the highest bidder. Neighbors began whispering in driveways and over fences, wondering how the very leaders of their HOA could have landed themselves in such a dire position. The public nature of the process meant that anyone with an interest in local real estate could see exactly who was losing their home and why. He arranged for the sales to be handled through reputable auction houses, ensuring the process would be above reproach. The listings didn't just describe the houses. They included precise legal descriptions of the land, his land, beneath them. Anyone attending the auction would know they weren't just buying a structure, they were buying back into a piece of history that had been stolen. The board members tried desperately to halt the process. They filed last-minute motions, begged for temporary injunctions, even reached out to political connections they thought could sway the outcome. But every attempt failed. The courts had already reviewed the evidence, the deadlines had long passed, and the paperwork was airtight. In the eyes of the law, they were simply debtors who had failed to satisfy valid claims. The fact that the debt came from living on someone else's land without permission didn't earn them sympathy. It made the outcome seem inevitable. When the first home sold, it marked a turning point. The proceeds went directly towards satisfying the lien, and because the winning bid exceeded the debt owed, the remainder was handled according to law, not emotion. The man who had once been the HOA target was now the legal seller of their most prized possessions. With each sale, the community's perception shifted further. No longer was he simply defending himself. He was reclaiming what was his in the most visible, undeniable way possible. Shock rippled through the neighborhood like a sudden frost, seizing every conversation and freezing the once smug confidence of the HOA leadership. These were people accustomed to control, to dictating rules and expecting obedience. They were used to being the ones who issued notices, imposed fines, and threatened legal action. Now they were the recipients of certified letters announcing the loss of their own homes, forced to watch as strangers toured their living rooms, inspected their kitchens, and placed bids on their backyard patios. Some reacted with stunned silence, unable to process how their positions of authority had failed to protect them. Others erupted in fury, shouting at auctioneers, muttering about conspiracies, and accusing the man of vindictiveness. But behind the bluster was fear, the kind of fear that comes when the walls you thought were solid reveal themselves to be paper thin. For the rank-and-file homeowners in the HOA, the fury was more complicated. Many had believed the board's version of events from the start, convinced that the land dispute was just a misunderstanding and that the man was being unreasonable. Seeing the legal system validate his claims so decisively shattered that narrative. Some felt betrayed, realizing they had supported leaders who had been lying to them all along. Others were angry simply because the scandal had tarnished the reputation of their development, threatening property values and creating an atmosphere of distrust. The board's allies dwindled with each passing week. Social invitations dried up. Longtime friends avoided eye contact at the grocery store. Those who had once spoken with authority at HOA meetings now found themselves sitting in the back, muttering complaints no one wanted to hear. The man didn't have to say a word. The sales themselves spoke louder than any speech could. As more homes went to auction, the panic intensified. Those still under threat of foreclosure scrambled to find solutions, refinancing, taking out personal loans, even quietly approaching him with settlement offers they hoped would stop the process. But his patience had been long, his preparation meticulous, and his position unassailable. Every legal move he made had been supported by documents, deadlines, and statutes. The fury of the HOA members might have been loud, but it was powerless against the quiet, steady force of a man who knew the value of striking only when the law was fully on his side. As the auctions continued and more board members saw the inevitability of losing their homes, some began approaching him behind closed doors. They came without the swagger they once carried, without the condescending tone they had used in earlier interactions. Instead, they arrived with carefully worded proposals, envelopes of paperwork, and numbers they hoped would seem generous enough to make him halt the process. But every offer he received had the same flaw. They were lowball attempts to buy back their security at a fraction of its true value. One board member, whose property sat squarely on a prime portion of his family's land, tried to frame his offer as a neighborly resolution, presenting a figure that barely covered the market rate for just a year of the land's use, let alone the decades of encroachment. Another brought in a lawyer who proposed a mutual settlement that would involve him releasing all claims in exchange for a single lump sum. An amount that, when compared to current appraisals, was laughable. He listened to each pitch with a steady, unreadable expression. In some cases, he let them speak for hours, watching them twist themselves into verbal knots as they tried to sell the idea that they were being fair. They wanted a quick fix, something they could present to the rest of the HOA as proof they had resolved the situation, without truly paying for what they had taken. His refusal was never loud or theatrical. He simply declined, citing the documented value of the land, the accumulated debt from the liens, and the costs they had forced him to bear during the entire ordeal. If they were unwilling to meet those numbers, the process would continue as planned. The law, not emotion, was guiding his decisions now, and he knew that accepting a lowball settlement would send the wrong message, that his family's land could be bought cheaply if someone pushed hard enough. The day of each auction carried a certain weight. These weren't hidden transactions done in back rooms. They were public, open events governed by state law and attended by anyone with the means and interest to bid. The county courthouse steps became the stage where justice played out in the open, where the homes of the very people who had conspired against him were sold to the highest bidder. The process was formal and precise. Notices had been published in local newspapers for weeks beforehand, meeting every statutory requirement. The auctioneer read the legal descriptions aloud, each one confirming that the sale included not just the structure, but the land beneath it, land that his family had owned for generations. Prospective buyers inspected the properties, some curious about the unusual backstory, others simply eager for a good deal in a competitive market. When the bidding began, it was fast and decisive. Investors, property flippers, and even a few private families competed for the chance to own homes in the otherwise desirable neighborhood. The irony was thick. The same HOA that had once tried to present him as a nuisance to the community was now powerless to stop strangers from moving into the very houses its leaders had once occupied. Each sale followed the letter of the law. The liens had been properly recorded, the debts properly calculated, and the foreclosure process executed without a single misstep. Notaries were present. Clerks recorded the results, and every winning bidder received a clean, legal deed to their new property. The money from each sale was applied first to satisfy the lien amounts owed to him, with any excess handled according to statute. What made the auctions even more significant was how visible they were to the broader community. Neighbors who had doubted his claims could now see with their own eyes that the courts had sided with him completely. There were no backroom deals, no suspicious last-minute reversals, just the steady, methodical application of state property laws. It was a demonstration of how deeply the legal system could cut when wielded by someone who had taken the time to understand it. For him, each auction was more than a financial recovery. It was a restoration of dignity. Every gavel strike that closed a sale was a reminder that the land his ancestors had fought to protect was still a force to be reckoned with, and that those who had underestimated its owner had paid the ultimate price in the most public way possible. By the time the last sale was finalized, the HOA was a shadow of what it once had been. Its bank accounts were drained from legal fees, its leadership scattered, and its influence over the neighborhood shattered. The once pristine image it had cultivated was replaced with a lingering stain of scandal that no amount of PR could wash away. Former allies avoided association, and the community meetings that used to be filled with confident speeches were now awkward gatherings marked by silence and empty chairs. What began as a blatant act of theft had been flipped into a masterclass in strategic patience and legal precision. Through persistence, research, and a refusal to settle for less than full justice, he had taken the very tactics meant to destroy him and used them as the instruments of their downfall. And that, my friends, is how a man who was supposed to be broken ended up rewriting the ending to his own story, not as the victim, but as the victor. The HOA thought they could bully him, steal from him, and bury him under legal games. Instead, he used their own playbook to dismantle them piece by piece until nothing remained but the echo of their arrogance. If you enjoyed this wild ride of justice served ice cold, make sure to stick around. Because here on A1 Storyteller, we bring you real stories that hit harder than fiction and prove that sometimes the underdog doesn't just win. He changes the whole game.